Hi, I'm Andy Ellis. I'm the host of this show and a potential Green Party candidate for governor of Maryland in 2026. I'm using this show to highlight interesting people and ideas that help me and you to understand what is happening and what is possible. You can learn more about the campaign by going to gogreen2026.com. Guests on this show do not necessarily support my campaign or the Green Party. They've agreed to come on to discuss ideas and issues. And of course, click the subscribe button on YouTube so you can keep up to date with this podcast. Hello and welcome to the show. It's May 14th, 2024. And tonight we're going to be talking about education and community colleges. Education is a top priority issue in Maryland. In 2021, the General Assembly passed the Blueprint for Maryland's Future, which increased education funding by $3.8 billion annually for 10 years. The primary focus of the Blueprint is on early childhood, primary, and secondary school, and this investment signals Maryland's commitment to having a high-value, world-class public education system. One of the pillars of the Blueprint is a focus on college and career readiness. This means a big part of the Blueprint is to prepare students for higher education. Maryland's higher education system includes community colleges, public four-year schools, HBCUs, and private four-year schools. These institutions are also a major focus of policy and budget deliberations. We have spent some time already discussing schools like Johns Hopkins, but today we're going to focus on community colleges. Owen Silverman Andrews is an instructional specialist of English language learning at a Maryland Community College and a doctorate of education student at UVA. He's focused on multilingual English learners that can take transitions between and within secondary and higher ed institutions. And Owen served for 2 terms as co-chair of the Baltimore City Green Party between 2018 and 2021. Owen lives in Lakeside, Baltimore, and we will cover a range of topics related to community colleges, higher education, and multilingual educational institutions in Maryland. I'm excited to get into this. Welcome to the show, Owen.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Andy.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to this episode for a while, and I think there's a lot to cover. So let's get started. Can you introduce us to the community college system in Maryland?
Sure. So Maryland has 16 community colleges, and they aren't part of a system like community colleges in, say, Virginia or New York or California. Community colleges have a good deal of autonomy in Maryland, and there's some oversight by the Maryland Higher Education Commission. There are boards of trustees of each individual community college appointed by the governor based on recommendations by state senators. But community colleges have more autonomy in Maryland than in some other community colleges systems around the country.
And how does this interact with the Blueprint for Education?
Sure. So as you mentioned, career and college readiness are a core pillar of the Blueprint, and community colleges have been enlisted in several ways to achieve this goal of the Blueprint. So one way is through dual enrollment, in which students who are high school students take community college classes while they're enrolled in high schools. It also affects the way in which family members of students who are in K through 12 schools are pursuing their education. So parents are more likely to take advantage of the convenience and affordability of community colleges than universities in many ways when seeking to further their education. So those are a couple of the ways in which community colleges are part of the Blueprint, even though they're governed not by the Maryland State Department of Education or the Accountability and Implementation Boards, which oversee the vast majority of the Blueprint, but kind of exist in this parallel education space.
Got you. And how are the community colleges related to the University of Maryland system schools?
Sure. So in New York, for example, there's the State University of New York system, and that includes four-year schools, bachelor's degree granting schools, and community colleges within the same system. But in Maryland, that's not the case. In Maryland, each individual community college develops transfer articulation agreements with public and private universities and colleges in the state, but they don't answer to the same member of Governor Moore's cabinet. They don't answer to the same trustees. So there's different governance structures, and that isn't totally unique across the U.S., but it's one of the defining characteristics of the relationship between the University System of Maryland and community colleges.
So they're when you say they're separate, like I guess so. Like if a student is at a Anne Arundel Community College, for example, and they want to go to Towson University, is there any particular linkage there, or is it based on each institution? How does that work?
Sure. So individual community colleges will make transfer articulation agreements with the university. Another not super widely known agreement is that if a student graduates from a community college, they have almost guaranteed acceptance to any of the public universities in the state, including College Park or UMBC, which are the two more exclusive public universities. So there are some built-in collaborative features, and then there are other less collaborative features as well in terms of supposedly competing for the same students, which I think relates to the financialization of higher education, which we'll talk about later, I think.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And let's actually get into a little bit of the money questions. One of the things that you advocated for this year was full and fair funding for Maryland community colleges. Can you talk about what was on the table in Annapolis during this session and why you and others felt that it was unfair?
Sure. So at the start of this session, or even before the 2024 Maryland General Assembly session, there was a lot of publicity around how this was going to be a tough budget year, how people were going to have to eat their vegetables, so to speak, and put up with or be satisfied with cuts to essential services, including transportation. And some of this was justified by the blueprint and the mandates related to funding, some of which are being fulfilled, some of which have yet to be fulfilled. And as a result of that, I think Governor Moore's budget team was really looking for places where they could save a few dollars, both actual dollars and kind of more speculative dollars. And so community colleges were one of those places where they publicly messaged in the media and in their public statements that they are going to make a cut. And they made that cut through what's called the Cade funding formula. Cade was a state senator, a Republican state senator from Anne Arundel County. And basically what the formula states is that for every dollar that goes to the public universities in Maryland, about a quarter and a few pennies go to community colleges. But even though this formula has been around for a couple of decades, it was never fully funded except for the last 2 years or so when there was a lot of federal money flowing to Maryland and they decided to give some of it to community colleges. So the proposal from the governor's team was to rebase community college funding, not towards the supposedly aspirational goal of 28.5 cents or so, which was what was agreed upon in the Cade formula, but to the actual funding of years before the pandemic, when it was more like 25 or 26 cents. And so in some ways it was Orwellian, this idea of rebasing, and in other ways it was somewhat honest. This promise was never fully fulfilled in the past. And so instead of pretending that it would be in the future, Governor Moore's team said, well, we're just going to cut that by a couple of pennies. And so that was the way the debate was defined. Cade formula, aspirational, linking community college funding to public university funding, which is a mathematical linkage, but not necessarily a linkage based on the needs of Maryland students, or accept these cuts. And of course, the compromise always ends up somewhere between the two ends of the debate. And so what some folks in higher education advocacy spaces are starting to say is, why did we ever accept that Cade funding formula as aspirational, 28.5 cents or so for every dollar that the University System of Maryland gets, when we know the University System of Maryland and its institutions can go after all kinds of other funding streams from the Department of Defense, from the Department of Agriculture, from private donors, and build up these large endowments, which further fund their activities, which aren't really accessible in the same way to community colleges. And given that they serve much more affluent students, given that they serve many more out-of-state students, why was that compromise ever held up as the aspirational goal of advocates and champions for community colleges? And if we were to base community college funding on the needs of Maryland students instead of on a compromise that was struck, a few decades ago, what would that look like?
I think that's an interesting question, because it's like a lot of budget stuff in Annapolis gets done by these formulas, and these formulas become the way that compromise happens, and the way of tying things together so that community college advocates, I guess in this case, would be benefited by advocating for more dollars for University of Maryland system funding. But I think that it's interesting how these formulas end up working in practice. And so what ended up happening? What ended up happening this year with community college funding in Maryland? Are you all getting cuts? Is it the same? What ended up happening?
So this is kind of where the switch ended up happening. There was all this messaging on cuts coming from the governor's office, coming from the General Assembly. And when you're afraid of cuts, you're more likely to accept anything that you get. And so roughly it worked out to about $22 or $23 million in proposed cuts based on this adjustment to the funding formula. And community college faculty who recently won the right to collectively bargain mobilized. So community college faculty from across the state, from the Lower Eastern Shore to Harford County to Anne Arundel County, came to Annapolis. We testified in front of the state Senate. We had digital advocacy tools that created hundreds of letters going to state lawmakers. And as a result of that, and as a result of advocacy by some more traditional players in the higher education and community college space, about $10 million was restored. And because overall funding for public universities and K through 12 funding went up, that pulled the overall allocation up. So there was a small increase to community colleges, despite the messaging of fiscal austerity or fiscal responsibility, which plays well for some Maryland politicians' political aspirations. The actual funding number increased.
So is that an increase for just this year, or is it a long-term decrease, but a short-term, here's some sauce for your vegetables?
If funding for the public universities stays the same or goes up in future years, then community colleges benefit. But because the ratio was decreased, cuts to the public university system in Maryland would hurt Maryland community colleges even more because of this adjustment to the CADE formula. So it means we have to keep fighting for fair and full funding in the future and stop accepting these compromises, which
right.
don't.
So that means every year, you all as community college professionals and folks that are focused on that educational mission, in addition to having to advocate for your own funding, now have to advocate for the four-year schools to get the funding as well.
Yeah. And I think one thing that I'll point out, though, is that for all these years that the CADE formula wasn't fully funded, administrators were fighting against legislation, which was eventually passed in 2021, that gave community college faculty and staff the right to unionize. And as soon as that legislation passed, now you could say there's some fortuitous timing there with federal funding increase during the pandemic, but that was the first time that the CADE funding formula was fully funded. So when the priority was on suppressing labor organizing, administrators might have been more willing to take a smaller piece of the pie. And as soon as that was accomplished and they could focus on what they maybe should have been focused on all along, which was advocating for funding from the state and from their respective counties, that's when it was achieved. So I think it's worth looking backwards, looking at the internal dynamics at these institutions. And then, yes, going forward, it makes sense for us to organize and advocate alongside faculty and staff and students at public universities. We share common interests, but I think the wealthier institutions and the institutions with larger endowments and wealthier students shouldn't be prioritized over community colleges, which are really doing a lot with a little and have been for a long time.
Yeah, so I want to ask a question about that with that little. So we've been talking about formulas and 4 cents on the dollar versus that and the other. If the state of Maryland were to cut 4 cents of every dollar that goes to community colleges and keep the budget level the same, say your campus say what had been proposed went through, how would that influence you, your fellow educators, and the students on your campus?
Right. So one of the drawbacks of not having a system, a community college system of Maryland with a chancellor, for example, is that each institution in some ways has a slightly different set of interests. And so community colleges in wealthier counties like Howard County, like Montgomery County, like Anne Arundel County, when during the Great Recession, the state pulled back on funding, their local budgets from their county budgets were able to make up some of the difference. And it really, as with so much policy in Maryland, Baltimore City and the poorer rural counties were harmed the most. And so I think any adjustments to the funding formula are going to be disproportionately borne by Baltimore City, Western Maryland, and parts of the Eastern Shore that can't make up the funding with their large county budgets. And so I think that's something really important to keep in mind when we're talking about organizing and advocacy for higher education, is that it has to be a whole state movement for fair and full funding. It can't be playing one county off against the other, which happens with it happens with transportation funding, for example. Or the same thing happens with community college funding. And we really need to look past some of the traditional red-blue county lines and see that Baltimore City Community College and Hagerstown Community College have more in common than, say, Allegheny Community College and Montgomery College. And so we need to make sure that we have workers and students at these institutions and community members in these counties recognizing that they have more in common than they have dividing them, and that they can't rely on the usual politics of Annapolis dominated by Democrats to ensure that their institutions are taken care of.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so that when the state funding dries up, the counties oftentimes can end up supplementing it, and so the poor counties end up, without the ability to supplement it. So the experience for the students there goes down. Is that about right?
Exactly. And when students have a choice, like in Baltimore City, Community College of Baltimore County, after the Great Recession, opened another campus at Owings Mills, at the terminus of Baltimore City's only heavy rail line, and or commuter, not the only, there is a commuter rail line, but the only local rail line. And so given that there isn't a big difference between out-of-county and in-county tuition, when funding was cut for Baltimore City, students, chose to go to the better funded institution. And so there are a lot of community college students who live in Baltimore City, but who commute to Owings Mills or Catonsville or Essex or Dundalk. And that really harms Baltimore City Community College.
And so is tuition like one of those levers that the schools have to play with when their funding gets cut. So like in that scenario that you just described, would Baltimore City raise tuition or raise per credit costs or raise student fees?
Yeah, tuition has gone up a little bit here or there. It's actually the one flashpoint. So for a lot of both state and local budget makers, elected officials, community colleges are kind of an afterthought, except when tuition goes up. That's often the time they hear about it from families and constituents. And so tuition ticks up, but because such a huge percentage of community college students get federal Pell Grants or Maryland Dream Act funding, tuition isn't as much of a flashpoint as it might be at a University of Maryland or a Towson, who, when they're raising tuition, they're talking about hundreds of dollars. Community colleges, we're talking about $2 or $3 per credit. So tuition is a factor, but it's a very small percentage of the funding, and usually less than a third for community colleges who are really dependent on, and that third mostly comes from federal aid. So it's really about state and county or city funding.
So like in Baltimore City or in Hagerstown, when the funding gets cut, that just cuts services. There's no way to increase the funding in order to.
There's no way to increase it enough to offset the cuts. Yeah. There's not a lot of excess to cut. And I'm not saying that universities have a lot of excess either in 2024 compared to maybe 2007 or 1997, but certainly there is more to cut at a university than there is at a community college. And so, yes, when state or county funding goes down, services to working class students go down as well.
Yeah, and I want to ask a question about the students. You just mentioned, that working class students have their services reduced. Who is the typical student population at a Maryland community college?
Yeah, community college students are more likely to be older. So we have a lot more students who are older than 21, the quote unquote typical college student age. We have more students who are parents. We have more students who are immigrants. We have more students who are multilingual English learners. We have a higher percentage of students of color at community colleges. We have more working class students. We have students who are working to complete a Maryland high school diploma at community colleges. And so we have students who are retirees who are taking classes at community colleges. We have camps. So really, community colleges don't just serve a small slice of the population when it comes to age. And we serve people, really from early childhood education through, people in their 70s and 80s are taking classes at community colleges as well. And the other key factor is we serve people who live locally. At every community college in the state, over 80% and often over 90% or even over 95% of the students are Marylanders. And they may be new Marylanders, but they're Marylanders, and they're very likely to stay in Maryland after they complete their studies, which is quite different than at a College Park or even a UMBC, where students might come here from out of state, take classes here, and then leave. That's not really the case with community college students. They're embedded in their community, they're invested here, and they're much more likely to stay. So by allocating budget dollars to community colleges, your decision makers are allocating investing in local communities rather than in college students from around the country or around the world.
Right. So, whereas somebody may attend Hopkins from anywhere in the world, fall in love with Baltimore and stick around for a couple more years and then go to wherever the job takes them. At a school like yours, it's likely people who live in the area, work in the area, and aren't planning on going anywhere. Maybe they are, but they're not. It's not a likely outcome as it is with a place like Hopkins or College Park.
That's right.
So let's abstract a little bit here. We've gotten into the nitty gritty of how community colleges are funded now, how they serve the students. What is the right way to fund community colleges? What is the right way for not just to fund them, but for state policy to relate to them?
Sure. So over the last decade, there has been a movement by liberal policymakers towards a last dollar tuition free model, which allows a county executive or a mayor to brand a program. In Baltimore City, it's called the Mayor's Scholarship Program, or it's often called Early College Access Program, to say that this community college is now tuition free. But what they really mean is it's a last dollar model, which means that after a student jumps through all of these hoops, which requires a lot of college knowledge, a lot of knowledge of college procedures, which are often related to whiteness and upper middle classness, then the college will take care of the last dollar remaining, and that allows them to message and say, yes, we have a tuition-free model here, but in effect, they're screening out people all along the process who don't end up completing all the forms, or have some other barrier come up imposed by the institution along the way. So I think the right way.
So wait, let me get clear on this. So in that model, if I'm a community college student, I go and get my various funding streams. I get what I can in terms of financial aid, in terms of scholarships, in terms of all that stuff. And then I come to the school and say, I still have X, Y, and Z as a gap. Can you help me cover it? Is that about how that goes?
Yeah, and it's especially targeted towards recent high school graduates. So we're not even talking about returning students or older students. But yes, that's pretty much how it works for recent high school graduates.
Excellent. All right. So the right way, let's get to that.
Yeah, I think the right way is to look at students as whole people, to consider their transportation needs, their housing needs, their needs for basic needs, right? We often see community colleges have these food pantries or other emergency needs relief funds, which students can apply for short-term funding to help with their life circumstances, basically poverty. And it's a neoliberal model. It's a
management.
Yes, exactly. And so if we instead look at community colleges as places where students come to have not only their educational needs met and other needs addressed only to the extent that a student can have them addressed in order to complete and improve the statistics of the institution, but as a place where students can have their childcare needs met, their transportation needs met, their food security needs met, their social needs met. Then we start to see these institutions as robust, locally embedded higher education institutions, which are serving the community in a more holistic way. And I think that should be the starting point, rather than how can we provide these working class students with enough relief from our society after it's taken, in Professor Spence's term, the neoliberal turn. How can we provide enough relief in order to get them through and on to the next step in their life, whether it's living in their car and attending University of Maryland College Park. Instead of looking at that model of just enough support to get through, how can we see these institutions as more robust centers for addressing communities' needs? And given how dispersed they are throughout the state, it makes a lot of sense to treat them that way. In a similar way that the community schools movement for K through 12 has started to see K through 12 schools as community hubs, not just as places where students move through the grades and their relationship with the system is limited only to education.
So instead of disaster managing neoliberal organizations, embedded community institutions that seek to make everybody's experience whole as opposed to just enough.
That's right.
How do you fund it?
So Maryland is a rich state. I think we can get so caught up in the austerity mindset of the latest economic fluctuation, macroeconomic fluctuation. We can forget that Maryland has more millionaires per capita than any other state. It has often the highest median income of any state. We have massive corporations doing business here, often subsidized arms dealers that are subsidized by the state because state policymakers were afraid that they would move across the Potomac, for example, or move to Delaware. And so we have a lot more resources in our state to fund our priorities than decision makers in Annapolis often feel politically comfortable going after. So that's the first thing, is to tax the wealthy and corporations. It's a common refrain, but of course it's the truth. The other one is to look at existing revenue streams and reallocate. So whether that, again, is moving money away from militarized aspects of state and local government, police, incarceration systems, subsidies for weapons manufacturers and others, and to look at where our higher education dollars are going. So they're not just going to community colleges and public universities, but for the last 5 decades or so, public dollars have flooded towards private universities as well, and not just in the form of payment in lieu of taxes with city and county governments that benefit institutions like Hopkins and Loyola and others, but also in terms of another one of these funding formulas named after a dead white guy, the Selinger formula, which has sent hundreds of millions of dollars to private universities with very few strings attached since the early 70s. So reallocating or threatening to reallocate some of these funding streams towards institutions like community colleges is another way that you can pay for a more robust and sustaining community college model.
Right. So in a scarcity model, the students at like a McDaniel College and the students at Anne Arundel Community College are competing for those state dollars. In a model in which we're actually taxing the people who should be paying their fair share, we're not pitting those folks against each other in the same way. And instead of a model in which says, how do we give the community colleges just enough cents on the dollar so they can keep that food pantry while making sure people are doing the educational function? We instead say, how do we use our wealthy state in order to build these community institutions that are allowing people to be healthy, thriving learners instead of, competing for austerity dollars?
Right. We need to reorient the way that communities and families and students see higher education, which currently is based on scarcity and exclusivity and stratifying the future workforce between elite institutions and supposedly open access institutions, which often don't have the resources or the orientation to truly be open access, and to kind of move away from that rat race mentality to one in which community colleges are part of a higher education system which serves all students and is not designed to funnel workers towards corporate needs and fill that kind of human resources function of making sure future workers are trained for their corporate jobs, but that we are building a solidarity-based higher education system, a solidarity-based economy in which students at these different institutions see their interests as linked, both while they're in school, and we've seen a lot of student activism recently, but also after they're in school and when they're in the workforce.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, and I know you've written more about the higher education system broadly, and I'd love to have you come back on and talk about that at some point too. But let's keep the focus on community colleges for today. And I know one of the things that you mentioned that you've done a lot of work on over the last couple of years is to help advance the unionization effort in Maryland community colleges broadly and specifically on your campus. Can you talk about that as a policy issue and also as an organizing challenge?
Sure. Well, Maryland has a system which I think goes back to the days of Dixiecrats and Southern Democrats dominating the state legislature and governor's mansion in Maryland, in which each little sector of public workers need to go to Annapolis, kiss the ring, and be blessed with the right to unionize. And that's not the case in many other states throughout the country. Which allow all public sector workers who aren't supervisors, for example, who just kind of have across the board right to unionize in states in the North and the West and the upper Midwest. In Maryland, each little sector, which is a relic of being a border state or in some ways a southern state, each little group of workers in the public sector needs to go and get a state law passed with their employers and other interests fighting hard against it. And so, that fight played out for community college workers over several decades. In Montgomery County, they were able to pass a local law which gave some workers at Montgomery College, which is the community college there, the right to unionize. But statewide, it wasn't until 2021 that legislation was passed, which gave certain groups of workers, full-time faculty, part-time faculty, and certain staff the right to unionize. And it was phased in over 2 years. And we've seen a couple of community college unions be formed and win ratification: Warwick, Hartford, Howard, and Frederick. And I think more will follow. But it's important to point out that adjunct faculty were at the forefront of this effort. They were the most exploited, as higher education in general moved towards this contingent labor model in which the people doing the most essential work at the institution teaching were treated as expendable and replaceable as much as possible. Adjunct faculty or part-time faculty have been at the forefront of unionizing across the country and in Maryland as well. So I think that's important to point out.
So just a question about that. So the 2021 legislation allowed adjunct faculty at community college to be part of the bargaining units?
To form their own unit. So part-time faculty can form their own unit. Full-time faculty can form their own unit. Part-time staff can form, non-exempt staff can form their own union, and full-time non-exempt staff can form their own union.
And can the General Assembly take this away?
Sure, I guess they could.
Politically, it wouldn't be viable for them, but like they could repeal or they could pass a law that took that away if they wanted to at some point.
Yeah, once the units are formed, I mean, they would have to break the unions in the way that Reagan broke unions in the 80s. So I suppose it's possible. I don't know that there's much of a precedent for it, but right, as opposed to one of the concessions of the New Deal, and so many of the limitations of our policy conversations in the U.S. go back to the limits of the New Deal when there was a strong socialist left party pushing the Democrats to be better, and President Roosevelt implemented some of those reforms. Is the private sector has the right, workers have the right to unionize. Now, a lot of the protections against intimidation have been taken away, and I think Andrew Anim, one of your former interviewees, spoke a little bit to that. But across the board, private sectors, workers' right to unionize is governed at the federal level through the National Labor Relations Board. But the Democrats in the New Deal era made concessions around farm workers, around domestic workers, and around public sector workers. And they did that in order to appease white, racist Southern Democrats, excluding folks who were more likely to be Black or Latine, more likely to be women, and in the form of public sector workers, more likely to be members of patronage networks that municipal and state local elected officials wanted to continue to control more at their whim. And so as a result of that, states got to decide state by state how they wanted to handle public sector unionization. And in Maryland, that has looked like a long string of expansion that costs workers an enormous amount of political capital, and kind of happens on a 4-year cycle, an election cycle often. So every 4 years, the library workers get the right to unionize, or the community college workers get to unionize. And so over 90 years or 80 years, Annapolis Democrats have been doling out the right to unionize to different members of the public sector instead of an across the board move, which would be greatly ease the implementation burden on public sector employers, on county and city budget makers. Instead, they've maintained this sort of kiss the ring model for their own electoral benefit.
Now, would it be possible for a legislator or, say, a governor to put in a piece of legislation that said all public sector people can unionize right away? We're going to stop this kiss the ring model, and here's a bill that has that happen. Is that policy possible?
I don't see why not. And I think what would be interesting would be not only to see which assembly members opposed it, but also it'd be interesting to see which public sector unions opposed it, right? Because this game works not just for the elected officials, but it also works for the
institutional unions.
Yes, the institutional unions who see themselves as tent poles of the Democratic Party and of the Maryland Democratic Party specifically. And so this gradual expansion model kind of works with their business plan, and it allows them to deliver wins for their members, even if those wins are very small relative to the across the board public sector unionization law that you're talking about, which would simplify things for so many people and allow public sector workers to have a lot more power in the state.
I think that's interesting. And I think that point about the institutional unions, not just how they exist on the campuses, but how they exist in Annapolis too, where they are the sort of mediators of access to be able to get these bills passed and things like that, I think presents an organizing challenge that people on campuses who are just trying to have collective bargaining rights and the benefits that come with that have. And so what has it been like to do after 2021, we get the win, the process starts on campuses. What has that been like, and what advice would you give to other people who are in the process of going through what you all have gone through?
Yeah, it's a big question. I think it's looked a little bit different in a place like the Lower Eastern Shore than it has in Prince George's County or Baltimore City, in part because of the power of counties to make budgets. So in terms of who you're organizing against, who the foil is, that has been a little bit different. And, the age-old saying that the best organizer is a bad boss has come into effect in a lot of places. So institutions which have had unstable top leadership or have had hostile top leadership, those have been some of the places where unionization has advanced most quickly. But I would say in general, like so much of modern life in our U.S. form of capitalism, higher education institutions are siloed. So departments and schools and even colleagues within the same department are siloed and kept apart, and are encouraged to look at for patrons in the administration to advance their personal interests or to advance their students' interests. And so collective bargaining and unionization is really a way to advance interdisciplinary collaboration, and for college faculty and staff to see themselves not as kind of entrepreneurial academics or as administrators in the making, but to see themselves as workers who are being exploited and asked to do ever more teaching and ever more committee work. and ever more work outside of their job description, to seeing themselves as workers whose interests are aligned with one another's horizontally, and not with their top administrators hierarchically.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think the point that unions are a part of the system is a really useful one, and that it does not free you from the system of capitalism and politics and all of that. Once your organization starts to unionize, it's just another space of negotiation and a space of contest. So I think is a really useful thing. I mean, look, it's good. It's a net good to have collective bargaining. It's a net good to have workers get protected. But the system you're describing, where you have to beg and beg and beg in Annapolis for years and years, and then you have to deal on campus with all of that, I can see why folks would look at this and be like, they make it intentionally hard to do,
Right.
Because it curtails power.
Right. Yeah. Most unions are not anti-capitalist. It's a way of organizing labor in a capitalist system and controlling that labor. It shifts the balance between owners and bosses and workers. But you see that in the private sector, the UAW negotiates for profit sharing, which shows again it's not about anti-capitalism. So it can be a base for more radical anti-capitalist organizing, but it's not in itself an anti-capitalism model. You also asked earlier about advice. Some advice I would say to workers out there, whether they're forming a grad student union or a Starbucks union. Some of those folks have really been on the forefront, so I don't know how much I'm in a position to give advice to them. But in general, some of the lessons that I've learned are, form your organizing committee first, and then negotiate with institutional unions who will be your state or international affiliate. Shop around, so to speak. I would say focus on autonomy and maintaining local power and local resources, rather than filtering those resources and power further and further up the state affiliate and international hierarchy. So that means maintaining dues so that you can do things that cost money at the local level, rather than asking for permission to do things from a state or international affiliate that has the resources. Focus on building relationships, really deep and sustaining relationships with coworkers. It's not extracting a union card from them. It's getting to know them better and them getting to know you better and building trust. And it's not a quick process. It is a transformative process, even though it maintains the same economic system.
Yeah, that I think is excellent advice, and I think that as the University of Maryland system folks go through this, and as the HBCUs go through this, the experience that folks on community college campuses have had, I think are going to be really important to that. It may not be the same, but I think it will be useful experience as they go through their decades-long fight in order to win that in Annapolis. So I think that the union part of the story is really interesting, and I'm glad we get to dive into that. I want to turn to the sort of specific area of work that you do, and you're the co-author of an upcoming book called When We Hear Them, Attuning Teachers to Language Diverse Students. Can you talk about the book and your approach to the field of language diverse students, teaching language diverse students?
Sure. So in recent years, one of the more salient theories of political thought and action is intersectionality. And we talk a lot about race and class and gender and sexual identity and ability and disability. And one factor that isn't a part of all of those conversations, although I think it fits into all of those conversations, is language and language justice. And so this book at its core is about language justice. It's about not treating all language learning as the same. The privileged kid taking AP French in Howard County and the immigrant student learning English as an additional language. They're both language students, but one has been minoritized and marginalized by our systems of education and by our language ideologies and policies at every level, and another has been advantaged for doing often what's easier work, learning how to order a baguette so you can go on your study abroad trip to Paris for 2 weeks, compared to a student who's learning to use a language for all of their functional needs and all their educational needs.
Right. So and it's often, I think, the student who's going to Paris could probably speak English when they get to Paris and still get their baguette, whereas the student that is coming to the United States is facing a pretty significant burden to be able to have some English.
Right. So English is an imperial language, and it's the most commonly spoken language around the world, and that's another form of privilege for people whose first language is English, is that you can go abroad and expect, not always receive, but expect to be understood. And in this country, we have created unequal access to resources based on the ability, despite longstanding laws on the books forbidding that. We've created unequal access to resources based on someone's ability to communicate in English and in a certain register of English, in a form of kind of white upper middle class newscaster Midwestern English.
So this is a sort of concept of, I think we've talked about it, but can you give a definition of what you would say language justice means?
Sure. So language justice is reparative and redistributive. So there is power within a society concentrated within certain groups, and that power is maintained through different forms of exclusion and inclusion, including, race being especially salient in the U.S. context and in others. But the way that language and race and other forms of identity and oppression and resistance interact is really significant. So I think language justice is restorative and reparative. It redistributes resources and power to communities and folks who have been marginalized and oppressed based on the way that they use languages or language. And that, but it's also, I think, has the potential to benefit, to be a rising tide that lifts all boats. I think multilingualism has cognitive benefits for privileged people as well, right? They're the ones who are most likely to benefit from them, but it doesn't necessarily, it's in some ways can be less zero sum than other forms of redistribution, because multilingualism is an asset for everyone.
Got you. And so the book talks to practitioners and theorists and folks who are working in this field. Is it a critique of the field with an offer of an alternative? Is it a highlighting of good practices? What is the sort of thrust of the work?
Sure. So a lot of language teaching focuses on production, and I think this relates not just really to capitalism, but also socialism as well, right? The focus is on writing and speaking, producing, and a lot of teaching is focused on what the teacher says and does, what they produce, the work that they produce, and the outputs of that work in terms of student performance, which is always measured based on what they can write or say or do. And so we attempt to reorient what successful teaching and learning looks like away from production, away from speech and writing, although those are, of course, important, and towards listening. So a successful teacher is not the one who lectures the best, but the one who listens the best and notices the most about what's going on with those students. And similarly with students, regardless of their level of privilege, the empowerment that comes along with being a better listener, which is especially something that men and white men and upper middle class white men are not at all trained to do. We have Toastmasters and debate clubs and all these things that are focused on production the ability to produce speech, but we have very few awards or competitive events related to listening. And we think that becoming a better listener is a process that language teachers would benefit from, that certainly the students in our classes would benefit from, and really, I think across the society, folks who have been doing a lot of the talking, if they focused on becoming better listeners, we would have a more just society. So that's the reorientation. We hope to make the book accessible not only to theorists and people at universities, but really we hope that people in teachers in elementary schools and parents of language diverse students are also reading this book as well.
Yeah, it sounds great, and I really look forward. When does it get released?
This summer. We don't have a specific release date. We just you can go to the website of Information Age Publishing, and that's where the information for the pre-order will be shortly. But it should be in the next few months.
Yeah, it is not. I will say it is not the book that is typical for the books on my shelf. But the way that you're describing it sounds like it is something that I want to read, something that I want to understand, and figure out how to do as you say and become a better listener instead of just a good talker. So I really look forward to that, and I want to read it. And maybe after I read it, we'll dive in another episode. Let's talk about what that English language learning looks like in Maryland, in community colleges where you teach. What is that? What is the scope of the work there on a day-to-day level?
Sure. So multilingual English learners, students who are learning English as an additional language, are the fastest growing demographic in public schools and in higher education in the state. And unlike states that have a longer history of significant immigrant populations in the Southwest or in California, for example, Maryland institutions across the board, not just in the education sector and not just in the higher education sector, have been slow to respond and have often excluded immigrant students or multilingual English learners from services which they should have access to. And so we've seen that play out in schools and other institutions across the state in Maryland as this community grows in number and in influence. And I think in some ways, I hope we're at a tipping point where in the remaining years of this decade and future decades, we look back on these years and we say, what were we thinking with some of those policies and procedures, and that we have a more multilingual Maryland, which has always existed, but has often been suppressed and seen as a transitory state towards people acclimating and assimilating into the English dominant society.
Got you. And this year, in relation to that, you worked with a coalition to pass a piece of legislation called the CALL Act. Can you talk about the CALL Act and what it does, what the bill does, and how it speaks to what you were just addressing?
Sure. So CALL stands for Credit for All Language Learning. And what it does is it requires community colleges to award credit for English language learning or ESOL classes. And it requires public universities to accept transfer of those credits as world languages or humanities credits. And that last part is important because it ensures that they count towards associate's and bachelor's degrees. So that's it at its essence. It's equal credit for equal work, because we have students whose first language is English getting 3 or 4 credits for learning very basic levels of Spanish or French or Arabic. And then we have students whose first language is French or Arabic or Spanish learning English at extremely advanced levels and receiving no credit at all. And if that is a racialized language policy that has cost our students time and money and success, and has stigmatized them within their institutions. And so this attempts to set right that wrong, and it really creates new pathways for immigrant students to come into these institutions and be more successful.
Yeah, and I think one of the things you mentioned earlier is that the students on community college campuses are likely to be older, likely to be working, and more likely to be immigrants. And so without this, when they get to 4-year schools, this credit deficiency for work they've done probably causes them to have to pay for another semester or 2 semesters sometimes, right?
Right. So there's that acute cost, the extra time and the extra money, but all the research also shows that for every extra semester, it decreases a student's likelihood of completing successfully. And perhaps one of the things that is worse than not having the opportunity to attend higher education is attending some higher education, sacrificing, advancing within well-paying careers that don't require higher education, like the trades, sacrificing time that you could have been earning a family-sustaining wage there because you invested your time in higher education, and then not achieving the goal of a marketable certificate or degree. And those students who don't complete earn less than students who went straight into the workforce after high school. And so it has a compounded long-term effect, not only that short-term effect of, oh, you needed an extra semester or 2, but also you didn't finish because the system was rigged against you, and now you're at a double disadvantage.
Yeah, and so this solves that.
Partially solves that. I think what I've learned, this is the first time that I've been part of passing a bill, a grassroots bill, not a bill out of kind of the nonprofit complex in Maryland. There's no quick fixes, and a law is just a law, and implementation is important. The regulations are important. Maryland Higher Education Commission is currently implementing those or drafting those regulations. But the legislature and the governor enact a law legally, but the people enact it socially, and there needs to be political education done. There needs to be mobilization done for people to ensure that those with institutional power are enacting the law as the coalition demanded it should be. And so it's never done. It's not like, oh, we passed it. It passed 46-0 in the Senate, 135-1 in the House of Delegates. Close the book on that, on to the next one. That's kind of the nonprofit complex model of advocacy. We need to put something in our 2025 annual report. So what's the next hot issue we can latch onto? We created a statewide coalition to win this victory in Annapolis, and now we need to make sure we're living it out in every county across the state. And that is a long-term effort. It's not a one-and-done effort. So it partially addresses the problem, but not fully.
It creates a framework in which the problem can be addressed if there is popular pressure in order to make sure people are fulfilling its goals.
Right. I think we need to think in terms of social movements and not just in terms of legislation. So it changes the incentive structure for institutions. It values the hard work of our immigrant students officially. But it does not overnight change the systems of racial-linguistic white supremacy and English supremacy in our state or in our country.
Right. And I think you make a good distinction here between the grassroots effort to pass a bill and the nonprofit advocacy sector to pass a bill, where the nonprofit advocacy sector is using access in order to change laws, and you're trying to use power in order to change practices. What does it look like as a next step in order to mobilize behind it, to build that power in order to make sure this framework is implemented, and then to set your eyes on other goals?
Well, it's not building a coalition of the willing that disbands after the legislative session ends. So I think it's coalitions, grassroots coalitions, not coalitions facilitated by paid lobbyists who need to maintain their access to politicians and so have to pad everything they say in order to not hurt elected officials' feelings. So I think it involves maintaining autonomy. It requires constant organizing. People need to rest. People need to take care of themselves. But it also requires studying the conditions that allowed us to be successful, building on them. And so I think we're doing some of that work, and there's a lot more of it that needs to happen. One of the things that was really important about this was that the identification of the problem originated with our students, and our students were a core part of the coalition. Our students were the ones being interviewed in a lot of the news coverage, and they were testifying. And I think maintaining that student power in the coalition will be really important going forward, because they're the ones who benefit materially, and that is constant work. It's not one and done.
Yep. And so what is the coalition? What is next? What does the coalition do next, either with other legislation or in order to put pressure and power behind this?
Sure. So
I think that you want to talk about it.
Yeah. No, it's not all up to me, but in my view, I think we have to make sure that the regulations, we shouldn't wait for the regulations to come down from the Maryland Higher Education Commission. We have to actively engage in the process of writing those regulations. We have to do the same at the institutional level, at our community colleges, at our universities. We have to maintain the visibility of the win, so that those who attempt to undermine it are seen as doing that, or are pressured not to do it. And I think we can't, pack up and go home after the win, because then the pendulum swings back the other way. And so I think there's more public education to be done. And there are some upcoming teach-ins that Community College of Baltimore County is hosting, that the TESOL International Organization are hosting. And then there's grassroots forums like the Community Work Group on English Language Learners that are made up of stakeholders that will continue to advance these issues and interests. I'm trying not to fall into that, okay, what's next? But I'll throw one idea out there for future work in this area, and that's around what's called world Englishes. So I mentioned before, English is an imperialist language. British and then U.S. American forces often at gunpoint spread English around the world, and now use neo-imperial or neo-colonial models to do the same. And that works in often surprising and sometimes predictable ways in devaluing the English of colonized and formerly colonized peoples. And so when someone with a British or an Australian accent applies to a college or university, or is enrolled in a pre-K through 12 school in Maryland, their English isn't questioned. But when someone with a Trinidadian or a Nigerian or a Pakistani accent does the exact same thing, despite English being their primary or one of their primary languages, both in their home country and often, because of that imperial legacy, the only language of instruction in the schools the primary and secondary schools they've attended, or the universities they've attended, they're often treated much differently. Their language abilities are devalued. And so while the Call Act focused on multilingualism, here we're focused on language diversity within English and the way that imperialism and white supremacy devalues the language practices, not only of immigrants from colonized countries, but also of people of color, Black folks, Indigenous folks, Latina and Asian, and working class folks in the U.S. who were born and raised here and also have their language practices questioned.
Yeah, I think that sounds fascinating, and I think it's a really interesting way to expand the work that you've done in the past. So, if there's somebody listening to this and they say, "This speaks to me. This is a thing that I want to get involved in," how do they work? How do they get involved in the coalition?
Yeah, so the community work group on English language learning is a good place to start. You can email me, owen.s.andrews@pm.me. We don't have a glossy website that we maintain. It is very much a grassroots effort, but I'm happy to do the one-to-one organizing, and there are a lot of other great folks involved with that coalition. So yeah, I'm happy to connect with anyone watching this podcast.
Excellent. Thank you. And I'll make sure we share that in that so that if there are folks who are like, yes, this is the thing that I've been looking for, we can get them in touch with you. I've got two more questions to go. Abstracting a little bit, I think, to take a bigger picture of some of the things that we've talked about, and then we'll wrap up. Does that sound good?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So in a Language Magazine article earlier this year, you and your co-authors advocate for a shifting of the labels from labeling students to labeling schools with a call for multilingual schools. Can you explain why this shift and what the value of it is?
Sure. So currently we have a system in which students are designated as English learners. And as a result of that designation, which can happen at any point throughout their schooling, they are tracked into separate and unequal educational experiences within their schools. So their language practices, even if they are multilingual and speak and use more languages than their monolingual English classmates, are deemed inferior, deficient, or at best emerging, and they're segregated physically in some cases, or educationally, curricular in terms of curriculum in other cases, from their classmates. And if we instead focus on the language practices of the school, and we say this school is unable to meet the communicative demands of a multilingual community. This school is an emerging multilingual school, right? It's not the student who has emerging language practices, but it's the school that needs to have its language practices further develop. Then we start to enter into a educational model in which resources are not tied to, funding models are not tied to maintaining students in a deficient separate track, but instead are funneled towards the entire school and enhancing its multilingual language practices for all students, regardless of their language background. And I think the research has really proven that a multilingual environment benefits all students. And so instead of focusing on remedying the language practices of multilingual immigrant students, but focusing instead on remedying the monolingual practices of schools and educational institutions, we start to move closer to that language justice model that we discussed earlier.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense to me. That is the whether we label a student based on a deficiency or an asset, labeling students is still identifying students as the problem to be solved, as opposed to looking at institutions and figuring out how those institutions can be that transformative entity. And in that article, you say non-reform. You make the call for a non-reformist reform, that is, transformative abolitionist frameworks of language justice that would extend beyond labels to collective action that transforms societal attitudes and systems. What does this look like for Maryland's educational system? If Maryland were to adopt this non-reformist reform, this transformative abolitionist framework, what does it look like in Maryland?
Yeah, so there's something about this postmodern neoliberal progressive moment we're in where we're really hung up on the wording we use. And it is super important, right? Because the words we use to describe our reality also shape that reality. And whether we, I was on another podcast with Susana Barrios, who's one of the awesome organizers I work with, and she said, as long as you're respectful to me and we're working together and meeting the needs of my community, I don't really care what you call me, if you call me an English learner or an ESL student or a multilingual learner. And so every few years, to kind of, in a way, to keep people off balance, it seems almost, school districts and the school system and national level academics say, okay, we can't use the term English learner anymore. We have to use emerging multilingual. Okay, we can't use emerging multilingual anymore. We have to say multilingual learner. And ultimately, while those conversations are important, they aren't as material as they should be. And so right now we have a federal and state funding, which flows, and funding formula, going back to the funding formula conversation, which flows towards hiring ESOL teachers or English language learning teachers, which flows towards schools which have larger immigrant populations, but is predicated on this model of keeping them separate, or at least keeping them at a disadvantaged status, which they must exit out of in order to be a full English-speaking student. And so I think abolishing that funding formula and fighting for broad-based public education funding in which communities aren't pitted off against one another based on identity or language, in which all schools have the funding that they need, and language learning and its attendant economic and cognitive and social benefits are available to all students, and not just elite privileged students or minoritized students. That's really the transformative work that we need to do.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent vision. I really appreciate the way that you frame the problem of why labeling students and endless academic and practitioner debates about labeling students is a distraction from the type of investment we need to make in order to make these institutions more just, more transformative. I think that is a really useful piece of that. And I look forward to working with you over the next couple of years to explore what this looks like. What does it look like when we envision these multilingual educational institutions and we envision them as part of multilingual communities? And how does that get us to different outcomes? How does that starting point of what we're trying to address create different funding priorities, different policy mechanisms, and different movements that are working to put pressure on political systems in order to bring material benefit to communities that are often left behind? I think that framing of it is really interesting, and the way that happens, where the focus on the label becomes a distraction from that focus on the just system, I think is a really valuable piece of research and scholarship that you all did on this, and it's one I want to definitely pursue further. Owen, is there anything you want to leave us with? Any last words, any thoughts and ideas, anything that we haven't touched that you want to bring up?
Well, I know in the intro segment, you say that, the views of people do not necessarily mean they're endorsing you as a candidate, but yeah, I'm happy to throw my support to you publicly, Andy. I think you've already proven to be a great green gubernatorial candidate, and I think this campaign is advancing really important ideas, which folks who are inside of systems would love to make publicly, but fear losing access in doing. So I think there's a lot of excitement that's building around this campaign, and I use my closing time here to say, go green 2026 and go Andy.
Thank you, Owen. I really appreciate that, and I will be calling on you to help with this, to help with ideas like this, to help with the many different things. And we'll have other conversations too. I know when we were talking about prepping for this, there's a lot of topics that we touched on a little bit here today that we didn't actually get into, that I think are also worthy of full shows. And so I really appreciate your support on this. I appreciate your work to make these changes, but also to approach how we do the work. And I think that the lesson to become better listeners is one that I really want to sit with and really want to work with, because you're right. That is not something we prioritize in politics and in most things. And the more we can listen to people, the more I think we can really understand what changes need to be made in order to allow them to live in communities where we can all thrive.
Mm-hmm. I think it's part of the green value of grassroots democracy, right? Listening has to be a part of that, and figuring out how participatory democracy works from a listening stance. It could be an interesting part of this campaign.
Right. And where listening is not just, I think, as you say, harvesting ideas or checking a box that says that we're listening, but is an actual committed practice of politics to hear, to be changed, and to listen at the right things. And I think that's a piece I'm really interested in continuing to work on from your work.
Yeah, the intro chapter I wrote is called Shifting Power Through Attunement. So I think that is something we can do in our personal lives and our political work, is to shift power through attunement, and listening not as an extractive or performative practice, but as one in which power is shifted.
Excellent. Owen, thank you so much. I really appreciate doing this show with you. I know we've been talking about it for a while, and I'm really pleased with how it came out. I think we had a great set of conversations, and I look forward to continuing the conversations with you about this, but about other important issues that I know that you're also active in. So thank you so much, and really appreciate this time, and look forward to the next one.
Thanks for having me on, Andy.
Thank you. All right. Well, this was a great show. I'm really excited to have gotten to talk to Owen about this, and I think that it sets a tone for the next couple of shows that we're going to do. We're going to talk to Dr. Nicole Fabricant of Towson University about her work, both on campus but also off campus, helping to organize young people in order to challenge the environmental racism in parts of Baltimore that have been often neglected. And then we're going to talk to Dr. Jared Ball, who's a professor at Morgan State University, and we're going to talk about his work in order to build institutional power around Black media and Black scholarship at HBCUs in Maryland. So I think those will fit in very nicely with the work that we did here today, and all the stuff that Owen talked about, the articles, the resources, and the links will all be in the description for this show. So thank you all so much for another great show, and thank you to Dana, who is my wife, the producer, and the person that makes all of this stuff go. And thank you to Owen for his great work, but also his endorsement and him coming on the show and taking the time to explain these ideas and get us through them. Thanks, and have a good night.